Hi there, art nerds. Happy holidays. Today I want to walk you through this watercolor draw this in your style illustration of Kara surrounded by magnolias holding a Christmas carol. So grab your paints. If you're one of my patrons on Patreon, you guys will find the line art over on Patreon for you to download and print. And let's get started. Initially, I was hoping for this to be a start to finish watercolor tutorial. I am sketching on fluid cotton rag watercolor paper. Unfortunately, my camera has a lot of difficulty capturing those lighter underdrawing sketches. So we're starting halfway through the sketch where I kind of have everything established and blocked in and figured out. And at this point, I'm just figuring out the details and I'm kind of tweaking the placement on things. So if you guys are not familiar with my work, I am a mechanical pencil kind of person. I hate having to stop what I'm doing to sharpen a pencil, and I am working with a very beaten up Pentel Icy mechanical pencil. I've reviewed a bunch of different mechanical pencils over the years, and there's some really great ones out there, but I keep going back to the Icy time and time again. So when I'm placing everything, I start with a really light sketch, which my camera just has so much trouble picking up. And then once I have everything kind of blocked in and figured out, I go in a little bit heavier, applying a little bit more pressure, and I start refining the details. And I'm one of those artists who likes to work really heavily from reference. So even though this is my original character, Kara, standing in the middle holding a candle, I reference basically everything else. So I looked up like Christmas wreaths and I found one that I really liked, and I kind of worked from that, changing things here and there, but generally working with the main color scheme and the main floral scheme. I also Googled like Christmas dresses for girls, and I found one that I thought would suit Kara's personality, and I went with that as well. So even though I do a lot of magical realism and I love drawing and telling stories of Lilliputians living in our modern human world, a lot of what I do is heavily referenced from real life because I feel like that adds some really important elements of reality. And it also allows me to kind of practice painting what I'm seeing and doing studies even while I'm working on illustrations. So for those of you who are not familiar with my work, I live in Southeast Louisiana, and our Christmases are never white Christmases. We have green Christmases and we have brown Christmases. So I thought for this illustration, it'd be nice to depict some magnolia flowers, because down here, those and like satsumas are typically seen as kind of signs of Christmas. So that's why I went with magnolia blossoms for this particular illustration. There's also some pine cones and some holly berries and some sprigs of pine needles and spruce needles in there for a more traditional Christmas aesthetic. I find when I'm drawing that it's really helpful not to get too attached to any particular object or idea before I kind of have the whole composition in mind. That way I'm not spending a lot of time drawing and redrawing and redrawing and redrawing and redrawing. Now, if you work digitally, that's not so much a problem. I also love to sketch digitally, and one of the things I really like about that is that I can constantly move and resize things to suit the needs of the composition. But when I'm drawing traditionally, I try to do it a little bit more holistically, where I sketch everything in super lightly and then I work on refining the details. So once I finish my sketch, I'm inking it in with a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen. Now, if you are a fan of the channel, if you hang out with me often, you guys know I love these. These are waterproof and they're alcohol marker proof, which makes them a great all-rounder. They're also fairly easy to use and you can find them almost anywhere. I have to stop myself from buying them at Michael's because Michael's is really overpriced for these, but you can get them on Dick Blick. You can get them through Amazon. They're pretty easy to find. I also really like the Tombow Furenosuke brush pens, and you can find those even at Walmart. So if you can't find the Sakura Pigma FBs, I highly recommend you try the Tombow Furenosuke brush pens out, either or. and I'm kind of just working my way around the details. So I like to start from like objects closest to the viewer to the objects in the background, and I try to get the face in there pretty early on. I'm also using this as an opportunity to kind of like refine the illustration itself and add in more details. So you guys noticed I drew in some more holly berries, and I also added in some pine sprigs and some spruce sprigs, because just because I've penciled the idea, it doesn't mean it's set in stone. And typically I like to ink in the face earlier on because my hand is still fresh, it hasn't started to hurt, and if I'm going to make mistakes, the last place I want to make is mistakes on the face. So I have early onset arthritis. It does kind of put a time limit on what I can do and how long I can do things. So typically, in a way, it's been great because it forces me to prioritize. So I do the faces and the really important details really early on while my hand is still really fresh. And then I go in and I kind of ink the things that if I make a mistake, it's easier to fix or it's less noticeable to fix. So I really like inking with brush pens because they've got some really nice flexibility, and you can get a lot of variety in your line weight without having to go over it multiple times like you might with technical pens. But you are totally welcome to use technical pens. I'm one of those artists who is all about what works for you and what helps you make the art that you want to make. So just because I like one thing or I'm using one thing, it doesn't mean you should feel like you have to, or like you're less of an artist because you don't, because that's not my intention. These are just my preferences. I would love it if you would give it a try to see if you like it, but if you don't like it, I totally understand. So once I've basically inked Kara in, I'm going to work on the background elements, again, working from those closest to the viewer to those furthest from the viewer. And this has been time-lapsed several times because frankly, no one wants to watch a 6-hour-long video of somebody inking and painting in real time. If they did, they would just hang out in art streams. So believe me, I don't work this fast at all. In fact, I frequently take breaks to check Twitter or to watch something on YouTube or to go get something to eat or get a drink of water or to play with Bowie, my cat. So this has been kind of cobbled together, and it's good to take frequent breaks to stretch your hands, to let your hands rest, to let your eyes rest, and to let your brain rest. I have found that with me, when I push and push and push with ideas, then I miss out on opportunities for unusual problem solving, because often when I stop and take breaks, that's when I have some of my better ideas or my better corrections. So after inking this, I allowed it to cure, to dry for 24 hours before I even erased any of the pencils. And I erased the pencils using a soft white vinyl eraser. I happen to be partial to the Pentel high polymer white vinyl erasers because you can get those things like anywhere and they work quite well. But you work with what works for you. So because the illustration itself, it has expanded quite wide, and I don't plan on stretching this illustration. I don't plan on doing a big background wash, or really in my head, I wasn't planning on adding a lot of water. I thought I could get away with just using some washi tape and taping it down to a sheet of coroplast. And all that does is it provides some structural support. You could tape it to the back of a sketchbook. You could tape it to some cardboard. You could tape it to some chipboard. You really want to work with coroplast when you're working with a lot of water, because it's not going to absorb any of that water. So it's going to maintain its shape and its rigidity no matter what's going on with the paper. And after I started taping it, I realized I'm not really getting much of the paper in with the tape. So I'm also going to use some bulldog clips to kind of secure it along the edges to hopefully prevent some of the buckling. I think these skeleton clips are so cute. I wish I could get them in larger sizes, but I think that probably wouldn't work for structural stability. But they work really well for this use case. Now, the only side I wasn't really able to clip at all was the side that has more chipboard on it, and I ended up using another piece of washi tape to help secure that. But unfortunately, that wasn't really enough. So for my watercolor palettes, I'm using a couple of ceramic palettes. One of them is an actual factual watercolor palette, and the other one is just a plain white plate from Dollar Tree. And I am starting by painting the cream color that's going to make up the majority of the magnolias, as well as Kara's smock. I'm also painting in a little bit of super light yellow, and then Wet into Wet, I added in a warmer, more orangey yellow to kind of create the glow of the candle. And for this cream color, there is a little, it's like mostly yellow ochre with a little bit of burnt sienna in there. I'm not trying to mix like a Caucasian skin tone. I want it to read as kind of a light, almost white cream color. So you have a few different ways to build up saturation. You can either do layer after layer after layer after layer. You can add in more paint and build up saturation in your mix, or you can allow your mix to evaporate over time. And I tend to work with all three methods. But for this, because I was working at a pretty good clip and I had my dehumidifier going and things weren't taking super long to dry, I decided to just add in some additional color to my mix to change the saturation that way. And again, I'm working heavily from a photo reference, so I'm not trying to paint exactly what I see, but I'm taking a lot of inspiration from it. And one of the things I noticed is that this cream color doesn't necessarily shade to darker browns, it shades to kind of a Payne's gray color. So I'm using a convenience mix. It's Winsor & Newton's Payne's gray. And what I like about Winsor & Newton's Payne's gray is that it doesn't behave like a Payne's gray. I love Payne's gray, but if I want a granulating Payne's gray, I'll mix that for just a very quick, simple, almost metallic or shadow color. Winsor & Newton's Payne's Gray works really well for that. And I'm using that to add in shadows on the magnolias as well as onto Kara's smock. So one of the reasons doing step-by-step tutorials is a little bit more challenging is because I am working so heavily from reference. So basically I'm just trying to recreate, for the most part, what I see or how the light is behaving or how the shadow is behaving. I'm not necessarily trying to go for like a perfect recreation. I'm not into photorealism myself, but I'm trying to kind of understand what's going on with the colors and the color relationships and with the lighting and how the light affects the color. So that's one of the reasons that I recommend to you guys to work heavily from reference, because it becomes something that you can't necessarily articulate in words, but you can recreate it because you've spent so much time building up that mental library and understanding those relationships. It's a little bit easier for me to explain what I'm doing with Kara. So I started by adding a shadow color to her eyes. I like to use ultramarine blue for that. Originally, I put down just like a very light wash of that all over the eye. And then at the tops of the eyes, where the eyelids would maybe be casting a shadow onto the eyes, I like to do a thicker, more saturated mix of that. So for her skin tone, I'm pretty standardized with that at this point in time. I like to mix yellow ochre with a little bit of scarlet to get kind of a lighter Caucasian skin tone. And this is another one of those colors that I'm going to be building up both by allowing it to evaporate, by building up a lot of layers, and by mixing it more saturated as time progresses. So for the center of the magnolia flowers, I noticed that we have a lot of colors going on. We've got yellows, we have a little bit of brown or red, and we've got some green. So I started with a yellow. I added in a little bit of quin. It's like a quin, not a quin red, but it's like a quin burnt sienna. It's made by Turner, and it's like an orange, a brilliant orangey red. And then I layered a spring green on top of that. So something else I never really do when I'm painting, either for tutorials or just when I'm painting for my own enjoyment, is I never work one area entirely to completion. So I always have several areas going at any one time. And that makes it a little bit harder to present it as a tutorial because I am jumping focus and I'm moving from area to area frequently. Like in this instance, I used a little bit of scarlet red. Usually I would use alizarin crimson, but for this color palette, I went with scarlet red to add the blush to her cheeks and her eyelids and her lips and underneath her neck and her elbows and her fingertips. And then I just couldn't quite get my skin tone as dark as I wanted it to. So I'm continually adding in a little bit more scarlet and yellow ochre. And while I'm waiting for that to dry, I use a little bit of burnt umber, and while that's still wet, some Van Dyke brown to get started on the pine cones. So the fact that I work so many different areas at any given time makes it kind of difficult, because it's not like you can see one area kind of come together from start to finish as a whole. I'm jumping focus as I go, but that allows me to paint a lot quicker, because as long as two areas aren't touching and there isn't a chance that they'll bleed into each other, I could paint like 6 different areas on the painting and they can all be drying while I wait. And this is something that I kind of picked up from years of painting watercolor comics, is you don't necessarily have to do one itty bitty fiddly little piece, let it dry, another itty bitty fiddly little piece, let it dry. It's really better if you kind of work on the page and all those different panels as a whole and kind of build that up and develop that together. So when I'm painting watercolor comics, I'll usually paint a scene of what's going on at a time, so anywhere from 2 to 6 pages at a time, and that way my lighting is consistent and my skin tones are consistent and my backgrounds are consistently mixed, because it's more noticeable if you've had to remix mid-scene than if you're remixing and just slightly off in between different scenes. People are not as likely to notice it. So for the magnolia leaves, I started with apatite green, I think, or pyroline green. It might be pyroline green. So it's a darker bluer green. And when that dried, I added in a layer of undersea green. And then while that's still wet, so I'm doing the undersea green, and then I'm going in with some indigo to kind of create that really nice dark leaf. So if you've ever looked at magnolia leaves, they're like a really dark green and there's a lot of shininess to them. And that's what I'm trying to capture with these leaves. So another thing I do for the most part is I paint my larger background objects first. So the magnolias, the leaves, the pine cones, and then I work on the smaller interior objects like the berries or the pine needles or the spruce needles. But since the cream colors are so watery and they're so light, I wanted to kind of get those in early, because those are colors where if I painted like a bunch of red and green around it, that would be very likely to cause those colors to reactivate and then bleed into that. And I want that sometimes because it kind of creates this atmospheric lighting. It implies that those colors are affecting the cream, and it might have looked really good in this instance. But in this, as I was painting this, I was just trying to be really more careful about that kind of uncontrolled color bleed, since I hadn't planned on using a whole lot of water for this illustration. This is one of my drier watercolor illustrations where it doesn't have as much wet and wet going on. And you guys will see if you look to your left that my washi tape is not doing a particularly effective job on the left-hand side at holding it down. In that instance, I probably should have used some of my 3M blue painter's tape. Now, one of the things I really like about these ceramic palettes is they are super easy to clean out while you're working. You just use some clean water. So there is going to be a lot of red in this image. So initially the candle was going to be a cream colored candle, but I realized there was too much cream going on, so I wanted to kind of balance the colors. So I shifted that over to red, which makes sense because Advent candles are typically red or pink depending on where you are in the Advent season. And I'm using the same base colors for the holly berries as well. And I'm trying to leave some hints of the white paper underneath to kind of serve as the light reflecting off of these glossy red berries. I'm also paying attention to the shadows on the magnolias and really trying to capture that depth of color. And something that maybe shouldn't need to be said, but I feel like it needs to be said because it's something I have to think about, is I'm also painting in between the individual fir and spruce needles and the individual branches. Like, I'm painting areas in the cream color, even if I think they're probably going to end up being green, because it's easier at this point to kind of use that as a background and paint on top of it than it would be to go back and try to add in more of that cream color. So with the pine cones, I'm also trying to make sure that I leave a lot of highlights. This is another instance where working heavily from reference and not just going from your imagination can be really helpful, because if you think about what you're seeing instead of not just what you think you see, you're going to be able to more accurately capture what you're painting, even if you have a cartoony style. That's actually something I really enjoy doing, is taking these realistic or real world objects, working from reference, finding ways to abstract it so it still works with my more cartoony art style. So I noticed that with the the spruce, they're either spruce or fir, I'm so sorry, I don't actually know the difference there. The smaller, pokier ones that look like a Christmas tree, that so it could be a blue spruce or it could be a Douglas fir. I started with a greenish gold for the highlights, and now I'm kind of working my way darker. So at this point, I added in some of that beautiful undersea green. I'm also going to use the Pyroline green for my darker shadows. And if you have not tried out Daniel Smith's undersea green, it's one of my favorite colors. I paint a lot of foliage, and it's this super granulating green color that can have this color shift from an olive green all the way to almost a dark blue green, and there's even some brown in there. And I find it really useful for foliage because it is so multi-chromatic. It contains so many colors that you can really kind of, just depending on what colors you use with it, you can make it appear to be a green gold, or you can make it appear to be a blue green. So I did kind of feel like with the pine needles, they weren't full enough. I'm using Hooker's green for this, so this is kind of just kind of like a middle of the road sort of green. And I'm painting in some additional pine needles just to kind of fill things out. I didn't ink them in first. I'm just kind of freehanding them. So that means being a little bit careful, because I am trying to work around those bulldog clips. That's one of the downsides of the bulldog clips. They do a great job holding the paper in place and kind of preventing it from buckling, but they make it really difficult for you to rest your wrist. So it means you're kind of hovering your wrist, which makes it more challenging to pull nice straight lines. So a painter's maul or a calligrapher's maul would be MAUL, not MALL, would be great for this, because I could rest it on that and it just kind of serves as a bridge over your painting. I need to find my calligrapher's maul. I have a beautiful wooden one that would work well for personal illustrations, but not super well for YouTube. Unfortunately, an acrylic one at that thickness would not be able to really support the weight of my super heavy wrist there. So I'm really big on building up color slowly, layer by layer. At the very least, everything has 3 layers of color: the highlight, the mid-tone, and the shadow. But often I go like to 6 layers of color. And sometimes that can lead to my stuff looking overworked. Sometimes it can lead to my stuff looking awesome. It kind of depends on what headspace I'm in and how much attention I'm able to pay to what I'm painting, and how strategic I can be with my color usage. So for this illustration, because I was already relying on an existing wreath as reference, I actually didn't have to think all that much about the color story. I just kind of picked Christmassy colors and kind of kept echoing the same colors. And I didn't necessarily have to worry too much about making things pop, because red and green are contrasting colors. Many of us tend to avoid them usually because they tend to feel so Christmassy, but this is a Christmas illustration. So in this instance, they work quite well. So we've got those bright red holly berries and that bright red candle and that bright red bow. And her smock is also going to have like bright red embroidery on it. And that's going to help pop and pull things into the foreground. And I'm working with a warmer red because warmer colors seem to feel closer to the viewer, whereas cooler colors seem to recede into the background. So we could have used a cooler red in this instance because red is already so warm and so vibrant and so saturated and so eye-catching, but I wanted to be able to kind of develop that color story where we're starting with a warm red for our highlights and then moving to a cooler red for our shadows. So for the main body color, I'm using alizarin crimson mixed with a little bit of Holbein's cherry red, which is a quin cherry red. And Holbein's quin cherry red tends to feel like candy, like cherry candies, like very synthetic. So I like mixing it a little bit with other colors just to kind of give it some personality so it doesn't feel so candy pop and fake. And alizarin, both of those are very cool reds. They have a lot of blue in them. They're not as fiery as, say, a vermilion or scarlet lake would be. And they're not as opaque as, say, a cad red, which feels more like an orange to me anyway. A cad red tends to be more opaque as well. Now, that said, I do realize around this point that I need to re-ink this piece because that's going to give it some clarity. It's going to help clean up those lines. It's also going to add some of that black contrast back into the illustration. So now that my holly berries have had a bit of a chance to dry, I'm going in with sepia mixed with a little bit of black just to get it dark enough on these pine cones. And I'm really trying to focus on the texture that the pine cone petals, I mean, that's what they are technically. Pine cones are pine tree flowers, but I don't know what we call the petals of a pine cone. But to kind of create that texture and really sell it. So I didn't ink, as you guys remember from the inks, I didn't ink every individual tip of the pine cone petal because I knew that I could do that more effectively in watercolor. So sometimes you have opportunities if you're working kind of like illustration-y, if you're doing mixed media where you're doing inks and then you're doing watercolor, you can sometimes work a little bit more effectively by being a little bit lazier in the inks because you know you can carry that off in the watercolor aspect. So generally, and I've said this so many times, I save Kara's hair kind of towards the end. That's kind of how you know we're wrapping things up and that things are moving along when I finally start painting her hair. And I like to start with a really light Venetian red, making sure to leave lots of room for highlights. And I just kind of work like progressively more saturated Venetian red, and then I work in some Van Dyke brown, and then finally for the darkest colors I use sepia. If you're doing this, if you're painting along, you can color her hair color whatever color, you can color her skin tone whatever you wish to color her. These are just because she's the one of two main characters in my comic 7-inch Kara. I've got a pretty standard way that I seem to always do it, but I definitely invite you to try your own hand at it, even if you opt not to do it as a draw this in your style or paint this in your style illustration. I would love to see what you come up with. So I'm adding in some of the darker shadows to the reds and to the berries, and I'm using naphthalide maroon for that, and it's one of my favorite colors for shading skin tones or for adding shadows to reds. It's this really beautiful maroon color. And that little fuzzy thing that you guys seen popping into the side from time to time, that's my hair. I'm in desperate need of a haircut, and my hair does this weird swoopy flippy thing when it gets a little bit too long. So I am painting today with silver black velvet watercolor brushes. I used to use a wider variety of watercolor brushes in my art, but as time progressed, I really like the silver silver black velvet brushes. I am really hard on my watercolor brushes. I tend to beat them up, and I typically prefer natural fibers because I find that they hold the paint in the water better than synthetic brushes do. The silver black velvet brushes are actually a mix of squirrel and synthetic, so they're a little bit more sustainable, and they've got a good belly. They can hold a good amount of water. They don't get all drippy on you, and they're a little bit softer than I would like, but I think I'm getting used to how little snap they have, and they have more snap than, say, like some squirrel brushes that are just super floppy. So these are what I like. They're what I use. I think they're a great brush at a pretty good price point, and I've just been increasingly buying more of them in a variety of sizes because I do like them so much. I think they're an excellent deal at the larger sizes. The smaller sizes, I do want a little bit more snap, but I still think they're great brushes, and I would recommend you try them if you haven't tried them yet. So this whole illustration, I avoided some of the hallmarks of my art, but I couldn't help but add a little bit of spray of yellow watercolor, red watercolor, and green watercolor, just to kind of liven things up and add a little bit more movement, because it was starting to feel very staticky and kind of samey to me. So usually I would be using the water spray bottle to get colors moving all the time, especially in the earlier stages, but I'm gonna just kind of keep it to just the splatter. And at this point, I'm basically done. I'm almost done with watercolor. So I'm going to remove those bulldog clips so I can actually rest my hand on the paper a little bit and use my watercolor pencils. And I love saving watercolor pencils towards the end of the illustration. And I have a little tip for you guys. If you are rendering something that is kind of browner or warmer, don't use white. The white tends to be kind of a blue-white. Use titanium buff or cream that tends to be a warmer color, and it just works better. I found that using a white color pencil on top of warm objects sometimes deadens them or makes them feel flatter. Using a cream or a buff or even a really light yellow doesn't do that. However, I do like to use a white watercolor pencil on my cooler objects. It doesn't have the same problems there. And in terms of watercolor pencils, I know I've said it a million times, but I'm saying it for the people who are new here. I really happen to like the Canon Museum Aquarelle watercolor pencils, the Derwent Inktense watercolor pencils, the Super Color 2 watercolor pencils, and the Faber-Castell Albrecht Dürer watercolor pencils. And last year I did a huge watercolor pencil showdown where I reviewed head-to-head a bunch of different watercolor pencils. So this isn't just like, you know, my personal preferences based on wibbly wobbly feelings. It's based on my personal preferences based on wibbly wobbly feelings and testing. And I decided that at the end, before I add the white gouache highlights, I wanted to go in and just kind of clean up the inks because they got kind of obscured by all those layers of watercolor. So I'm using my same Sakura Pigma FB just to kind of lightly re-ink this, just to add in some clarity, especially in areas where I felt like the watercolor had like negatively obscured the ink. Sometimes it can, in a way, positively one by lightening up the inks, which could work well if you're painting like a light source or something. But sometimes you want to just kind of clean that up a little bit, especially in darker areas or where it might add some additional clarity. And then finally, the white gouache. So my advice with gouache is you could also use a buff gouache for your warmer objects, and that would be smart, but I don't have any handy. I just have white gouache, and I'm using Winsor & Newton's white gouache, and one tube will really, for white, if you're a watercolor illustrator and you're just using it for highlights like I do, it'll last you like forever. And I'm still using one of the silver black velvet brushes, but if you're newer to using gouache, since it is a heavier bodied, more opaque kind of watercolor that's meant to be opaque, I would recommend you use a stiffer small synthetic brush for that, and it'll give you a lot more control. So once my illustration dried fully, I remove the washi tape as carefully as possible. I mean, you don't want to rip the paper, and generally you want to remove it at a 90-degree angle away from your illustration, because if it's going to tear the paper, you don't want it to tear into your art. You want it to tear away from your art. And that's it, another watercolor illustration completed. If you have any questions about my process, the materials I use, or my techniques, I would love to hear from you. You can reach out to me down in the comments below, or you can hit me up on my art-centric Discord server, The Paint Box. I will tell you, I am 100% more likely to reply to you on Discord, just because I actually have it up and can catch it, and I'm not always notified when YouTube has comments. So if you want some help, you want some advice, Discord is the way to go. I had a lot of fun chilling out, relaxing, and painting this watercolor illustration. Lately, I have been doing so many unboxing swatches since we're preparing for Christmas that I haven't had time to just sit down and paint. So being able to paint this and share it with you guys has really been a pleasure. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. It really means a lot to me. Hopefully this has inspired you to either paint this illustration yourself, try your own take on this illustration, or create your own holiday-inspired watercolor illustration. In the end, it is my goal to help you guys make art a habit, and I'm doing so by trying to make art as accessible as possible. And I can only do that with the support of my amazing patrons on Patreon. Their names are about to follow, but I just want to take a moment to say thank you so much for all the help that you guys have given and all the support that you've given in 2020 and 2021. Thank you guys so much. So have a happy and safe holidays. If you decide to paint this, please tag me at NatoSoup. I'd love to see what you paint, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye, guys.